Okay, we'll go in right away. How's that?
Sure.
Okay. Showtime. Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome one and all. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of choice going, get in your most comfy chair, relax, kick your feet up, relax. It's winter time here in Kingston, and it's fret outside. It's cold outside. It's Saturday, to use a Persian word, and it's a great night to settle in and get enthralled with the JFK assassination with our guest. And our guest tonight is Paul Bleau returns. And Paul, of course, as everybody knows, holds an MBA from McGill University in Montreal, where I went to school. He owns Bleau Marketing Communications. Paul's also in his 18th year, count him, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 18th year as a professor in the P.W. Sims Business Program at Champlain St. Lawrence College. So tonight, if it's okay with you, Paul, welcome
Sure.
back to the show, by the way.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to jump into the Jack Ruby aspects
Yes.
of it. Everybody believes that he followed orders to have Oswald killed. Do you believe that Oswald knew Jack Ruby before the assassination took place? That perhaps he met uh, Oswald in his club, the Carousel Club?
Some witnesses place him there. And
Yeah, I know Bev Oliver does.
and there's another guy, a taxi driver, who
Oh,
at first said he dropped Oswald off. I think he was with David Farron. I'd have to
oh,
review that, but and the taxi driver was pressured into changing the story, as
hmm,
so many witnesses were
yeah.
pressured to do. Uh, I would tend to think that either him or an Oswald impersonator was in there. We have a chapter on Oswald impersonations, but maybe we can get to that one after I talk about Jack Ruby if you want. Um, Jack Ruby is an interesting character because he, of course, ran a nightclub, a strip joint in Dallas called the Carousel Club. And you didn't get involved in that type of business if you weren't dealing with the mafia. And in his case, he would have had to be dealing with Carlos Marcello, even to get strippers uh, to how could I put it? It was a territory where if you were involved in smuggling, drugs, prostitution, that's how you did business. And the some of the lieutenants of Marcello in Dallas were the Campeses and Civello. Now, what made Ruby such a fascinating character was that this guy, also described as a disgruntled loner, that killed, this is what the Warren Commission, that killed Oswald, who killed Oswald to prevent Jackie Kennedy, the hardship of going through a trial. Okay, basically that was why did he kill Oswald? When you looked at motive, that was the first motive that came up. The more you looked into Oswald, the more the Warren description persona was completely destroyed, and the HSCA destroyed it completely. And they destroyed it in this manner. First off, they said, hey, you know what? When we look at all the phone calls that he was involved in, the long distance calls, and we're approaching the assassination, exponentially they explode. And there are always calls with hitmen, mafiosi, you name it. Then they point out that he had close ties to hitmen like Lenny Patrick and a guy called Dolan. So they're saying, hey, wait a minute, these guys that he has relationship with, Louis McWillie, they're all mafiosi. So don't, let's not. Then they say the first visitor he gets in jail is Civillo. Okay, the top guy, the top mafia, probably going in there and say, hey, Jack, we got your back. Don't worry about it. We'll get you a lawyer. Shut up. you know. Uh, as much as the Kennedy assassination was described as one where the security was absolutely hopeless. I mean, it was the worst
mhm.
security. And a guy, Vince Palomara, he compared the security on that day versus what you would normally find. And look, everything about it, like the slow turn that the motorcade took to get into a point where there could be triangulation of fire at a very slow rate. I mean, just the fact that a guy like Oswald, who was in Russia and who was in Mexico City making contacts with people in the Russian and Cuban consulates a few weeks before the assassination, who had been arrested in New Orleans, handing out Fair Play for Cuba committee flyers. How could that person not be on a security index? And the Secret Service didn't even know about him, okay, beforehand. The FBI did not pass on any information about Oswald. So how someone like that could be actually perched in the sixth floor with an open window, right? And things like open windows are things, there had been threats throughout the whole year of Kennedy being shot from a tall building all the time. So
Mhm.
that's the first thing that they should have had their eyes on. Now, what happens 2 days later after Kennedy dies? Oswald, the most important witness in the assassination, gets taken out in the basement of the jail or the courthouse where he's being transferred. Now, the HSCA, everybody said, oh, he made it down the ramp in a sneaky way. The HSCA, no, he had assistants getting in there. He had assistants. They did not buy the fact that he simply slipped through because, and again, we're talking about the most important witness. Now, the other things the HSCA pointed to is that there's a recorded trip of Ruby going to Cuba, right?
Mhm.
And going over 2 or 3 times in less than a week. And he's visiting Santo Traficante
Yeah.
in a Cuban jail. Santo Traficante just happens to be the mafioso who the
Murder.
CIA go into cahoots with to try and take out Castro, right? That's Santo Traficante. When he was in Cuba, was under Mayor Lansky, and he was in charge of all the heroin trafficking that would just traffic and go through Cuba and end up in the United States. And guess who's trying to spring him? Our friend Jack Ruby. So when you look at Jack Ruby, you then see that during the 48 hours while Oswald's arrested, he's stalking him. He is stalking him. He's there at 5 or 6 times. Either he first actually goes to Parkland Hospital to check out to see whether Kennedy's dead or not. Okay. And he's seen there by a guy called Seth Cantor. Then he goes and he's seen a number of times and you can see him on film.
Mhm.
And the funniest thing, I'm sure, Brent, you're aware of this, is there was a conference and where the prosecutor, what's his name, Wade, right? He's
Mhm. Henry
that
Wade.
Henry Wade is saying that Oswald is part of the Free Cuba Committee,
Hmm.
and he gets corrected. He gets corrected by someone is heard saying, "No, that's the Fair Play for Cuba Committee." And who is it? Jack Ruby's correcting that. I mean, that's not a commonly known, event. So how did he? Out of all the journalists, lawyers, and everybody who could have corrected Wade, it's Jack Ruby who corrects him. What's happening there? So it's clear that Jack Ruby, if you look at all that, let me bring out something else that I think is fascinating. To get to see Trafficante, okay, he went to see a guy called Jack McKean. Jack McKean was one of the top gun runners who became a really good friend of Castro's because before Castro took over, the United States wasn't necessarily against him. Gun running for Castro and helping him wasn't a bad thing. But eventually, McKean did go to jail for his gun running. And Ruby goes to meet him. And he says, "Hey, can you put in a good word for me with Castro? I'd like to get in there. I might be able to get him some Jeeps and, something like that." Now, guess what happens some 5 weeks before the assassination? This McKean character receives another visitor, and the visitor is Oswald. And Oswald is with a Cuban exile, and he wants to buy guns,
Mm.
savage guns for a huge price. And McKean says, no, I'm not doing it. But the thought there that John Armstrong was, imagine if Oswald had got his guns from the supplier of guns of Castro. Wouldn't they have said that, hey, you know what? Castro and his network was in cahoots in this whole thing? Because the first plan, guys, for your audience again, was not to go the lone nut route, right? It was to say that Oswald was in a conspiracy with Cubans, so that the Americans could have their excuse to reinvade the island. But Johnson didn't want that. He wanted to go the lone nut route because he knew of the risks involved there. And but the CIA was still making all sorts of rumors and
It's
pushing this
important to
idea.
remember too, sorry to interrupt you. It's
Go ahead.
important to remember too, folks, the Cuban Missile Crisis was just a year prior to the assassination of Kennedy, and we came that close to all of us not being here. And
Correct.
that's not an exaggeration, that's
No, it
truth.
is not. It is
And
not.
this is what was going through many people's minds with the assassination. And I'd argue why part of the cover up. They certainly didn't know what was going on. And the information flowing in that day, November 22nd, 1963, which was a Friday, was certainly making the Cubans look like they were guilty, if not the Russians. So,
Correct.
yeah. So, sorry to interrupt you. I just
No,
wanted to
no, that's it.
clarify that,
I
give
think
some
that
context.
that's our chapter on Ruby. So I think if you show that
Yeah.
Ruby was on a mission to gag or silence Oswald forever, you don't have a lone nut here who committed an assassination.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Yeah, Jack Ruby certainly is one of those characters that is heavily mafia connected. And do you feel the mafia had a role to play in the
Yes, I do, but
assassination?
I don't think they had the top role because there
Mhm,
are things that went on with the autopsy. There are things that went on in
mhm.
Mexico City, and certain aspects of how Oswald was, handled that the mafia couldn't do on their own. Like they couldn't rig an autopsy like they did, or they couldn't have set up, I don't think, Oswald to look like he was meeting the head of assassinations in the Russian. So there's so many links again between Oswald and intelligence, but it would make sense that some people within the intelligence group that are good in regime change operations, they'd use surrogates. They would use surrogates in the form of the Cuban exiles who were all organized under the CIA out of JM Wave in Miami,
Mhm.
as well as mafia people. Certainly, Ruby was part of the mafia.
Without question. Without
Yeah, no
question.
question.
That's a good segue, actually. You mentioned the medical evidence and the cover up. Can we cover that now? Now, the medical evidence that the book claims, the book is called The JFK Assassination Chokeholds, by the way. Our guest tonight is Paul Bleau, is one of the authors, would have been thrown out of court. The medical evidence would have been thrown out of court. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, sure. So, first of all, the three doctors had, I mean, almost no experience, right, in conducting autopsies. The very best person was probably Milton Helpburn, I think out of Washington. So this was a military autopsy. It was done out of Bethesda. And first thing you notice that just didn't make any sense is that the autopsy room was crowded, absolutely crowded, packed with generals, admirals, and you name it. And they were giving orders. And Pierre Fink admitted that during the Garrison investigation. The second thing is that they asked for help. They say, hey, we're going to need some help on this autopsy. And it was refused. And when I say they, I'm talking about Humes and Boswell. Then, look, begin with this. They didn't do trajectory analysis. So, in other words, the famous single bullet, right? If it had done what it said it did, there'd be a trajectory through and through that you could put a probe through from the neck to the back. They didn't do that. So you couldn't really figure out angles of, I mean, there was some figuring out because the FBI officers, Seibert and O'Neill, who were at the autopsy, said that the bullet was coming down in a 45 to 60 degree angle, but it wasn't done. They didn't, at first, they didn't even, they didn't dissect the brain, right? So the brain dissection again would have, shown trajectory of the bullets. There's so many things. Like I'm not a guy like David Mantik,
Hmm.
who often wrote about it, pointed out so many things that went wrong about the autopsy. Now, the other thing that is absolutely crazy is that and I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but the average brain, right, weighs what, 1,300 grams, I think. Okay. They claim that Kennedy's weighed 1,500.
Yes. Yeah.
1,500.
Dr. Cyril Wecht. Yeah. Told me that.
So
Mhm.
1,500. Now think of this. There was so much cerebellum that splattered from that famous headshot. I mean, it was on the back of the car. It hit some of the motorcycles. Uh, Jackie picked some of it up with her
Hmm.
hands. There's absolutely no way that the remaining brain in Kennedy would have weighed more than the average brain. The guy who does the autopsy, right, uh, uh, Humes, he burns not only his notes, he throws them in the fireplace, he burns the first draft of the autopsy. Now, he could do that. You know when he found out he could do that? Is when he found out 2 days later that Oswald died and there wouldn't be a trial. Otherwise, he would have had to present his notes as evidence. So now, of course, they could write, a fairy tale, right?
Yeah.
And he sat down with a guy called Galloway, and they composed the autopsy together. So that's what I can tell you about. That was written up by Jim DiEugenio. I'm sure there's a lot more stuff in there, but it was a fiasco. So there's no way you would be able to convict someone with that type of autopsy. No way.
No way at all. It's funny, I spoke with Mark Lane prior to his death about that. And Mark Lane, folks, was one of the first investigators of the Kennedy assassination. He put out a book and a documentary called Rush to Judgment. He was a civil rights lawyer. He had worked with President Kennedy, he had worked with Dr. Martin Luther King and also Bobby Kennedy. And he was asked by Marguerite Oswald, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's mom, to represent Lee Harvey Oswald's interests at the Warren Commission. Lee Harvey Oswald had already been assassinated. And Mark looked at the evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald and he said, I could have got him off just like that. It wouldn't have been a trial. He said there was so much lack of evidence to prove that he was even in the sixth floor depository sniper's nest that day that it wouldn't have been a trial at all. So that's something to bear in mind is a lot of the evidence, as we had mentioned in last show, like Gerald Ford, to align, quote unquote, I'm going to paraphrase him, to make the evidence look more like the report. He took that wound in the back we've been talking about that came down below JFK's head and moved it up to his neck to come in his neck. So that's a good 6 inches he moved up so it would show that it came through his neck more easily because as we know, when a bullet comes down, it can't come up out here unless it hits something, and it didn't hit anything.
It's one of the top criminologists in the US. He says there's a second magic bullet in a sense. Because try and think of this, right? The
Mhm.
Texas School Book Depository is behind Kennedy over there, right?
And over his right shoulder.
Yeah. So now
Yeah.
think of a bullet that enters coming in this way, right?
Hmm.
And exiting here. So he said it had to do a 90-degree turn within the head. I'm talking about not me, but this
Right. This
person. He said
magic.
it had to do a 90-degree turn within the head. If you accept the entry points that the Warren Commission or others claim it did, and that the exit is around here,
Hmm.
and that the Texas School Book Depository is back to the right of Kennedy,
Yeah.
then you have it going right to left and then left to right exiting. So that's what he says. He says there's a second magic bullet.
It sounds like a Cirque du Soleil bullet, I call it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And get this for your audience, okay? The two fragments they find in the car is the front of the bullet and the back of the bullet in the car. But what's left in Kennedy's head is the center of the bullet, according to them, you know?
Yeah,
So how does that happen?
it
How
just
does
doesn't.
that happen?
It just
Anyway,
doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. And I don't know if you're familiar with Sherry Feaster's work, but this is a senior crime scene investigator, folks, that found a frontal shot, and her work is immaculate. And because people forget that when Kennedy was hit in the head, he was looking at the South Knoll, not the Grassy Knoll that we know that's on the north part. Not to say there wasn't a shooter there, but the kill shot she feels came from
yeah.
the South Knoll in order to blast the back of the head out. And how do we know the back of the head was blasted out? Witnesses.
Oh, witnesses,
Parkland Hospital and everywhere else. And even though the autopsy showed us for
even
that.
Beth is
Show
that
that.
we have in the files the drawings done by over 40 people or
Yeah.
descriptions, and they say an egg-sized shape, occipital. Okay, that is an
Yeah.
exit wound. So,
So we're both Canadians. Why does this matter to Canadians? Now, we even have a JF Kennedy School, John F. Kennedy School in Montreal. Maybe there's one in Quebec City. I'm not sure of. I guess what I'm trying to get across, folks, is that Kennedy was seen as hope. He was seen as a visionary. He was well respected across the world by everyone, even people that didn't like him, Khrushchev, for example. As a Canadian, why are you interested in the JFK assassination? What
well,
brings you to it?
yeah, I think I was in France. You go to Quebec, you go to
Mm.
everywhere. I don't think there's more streets in the world that have a name other than, Kennedy is the most popular name for a street everywhere. Why? Because he didn't have a US only vision, he had a world vision, right? He was for world peace.
Hmm.
He wanted to get out of colonialism. He even, even things like the climate and the pharmaceuticals and all
Women's
sorts
rights
of
and all that.
issues that, he was looking at, and he wanted to make the place better for the whole world.
Yeah.
Okay. And he, uh, you know, when Lumumba from Congo was assassinated, he was totally dejected because here's someone that, would have really represented his people well. Instead, what happened is a dictator was put in his place, and that country was, I mean, mangled by this dictator who, yeah, completely, so. He definitely had a different vision. Of course, we all know about his civil rights. So, the minorities in the U.S. finally had a voice. We had a good neighbor. We had a really good neighbor, and we've always
Mhm.
had very strong relations, right, with the U.S.
Well,
But
I always feel they literally are family, especially when we look at the history of the United States. We have the whole Loyalist movement here along the southern part of Ontario, and basically they're just transformed Americans.
yeah,
They came north because they wanted to stay loyal to the crown. So, I mean, even during the War of 1812, when we went at it, we had cousins fighting each other. It was more of a civil war in a sense as well. So, yeah, during the hostage crisis, we rescued hostages during the Iran thing. 9/11, we
oh
took in
yeah,
the airplanes. We kept our air open, even though we were getting reports of some pretty scary stuff going on in Canadian airways. We found planes with box cutters on them as well, but we kept them open and all kinds of things like that. So yeah, we're always there for them.
oh yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
And look, the other misconception, because I did an analysis, Brent, on how history books relate the assassination. Okay, and I talked to the authors. Most perpetuate the idea of this lone nut. Okay.
Hmm.
And they all base it on the Warren Commission. They're not aware of the five subsequents because I questioned the authors on that. But the other misconception is that he was a warmonger who started the Vietnam War. There's nothing further from the truth. And I'm a teacher, right? And to see captive audiences of students being brainwashed with that kind of stuff, like saying, hey, wait a minute, the HSCA said that there was a probable conspiracy at the end. And it wasn't just because of acoustic evidence, it was because of everything that went down.
Hmm.
So when you see 15-year-olds following and reading textbooks and are being misled or misinformed, I mean, I have kids, I don't feel good when I see that. And I think, unfortunately, we don't have very nice models sometimes, and Kennedy was one of those models.
I agree completely.
That, and what's happened to the trust in politics and media since the Kennedy assassination? What followed, right? Just went downhill. You had Vietnam, you had Martin Luther King, RFK, then you had Iran-Contra, you had Watergate, and back then the confidence in the people, they believed them. But today, there's no belief. And that probably explains some of the polarization that you see in the US and the elections and that took place right now is
I agree.
it's just a general lack of trust in the leaders.
We're going to have to start to wrap up now. I'm going to ask you a question I literally ask every guest who comes on the show, and that is you're literally speaking to the whole university, college, community radio station age people, students, the youth of today. What would you say to them?
Well, okay, so I would say, first of all, be curious, okay? Look into things that you'll see in the news or you'll see. Don't trust just anything you'll hear on the internet. It's a good source, because you get a whole varied, but there's an awful lot of misinformation there. And just like there's misinformation with mainstream media. So do your homework, ask questions, and don't be angry if you thought one way and then next thing you know, say, hey, you know what? Maybe I got it wrong.
Hmm.
Maybe I got it wrong. I'm at a certain age where they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but I try to evolve with new information. And if you can evolve all the time and you can learn all the time and not be stuck in your ways. So that's what I would say to students. And also, look, try and think of the world values. In business, they always said maximize profits and minimize risk. If you can think maximize profit while you're making the world a better place. So if you're doing something great for the climate, if you're doing great for, if you can think along those lines, I think you will be in the right place and not making the quick buck, an easy way. Do it that way. Make the environment a better place, make it more peaceful, and people will love you for that. So I would say, Brent, would be a good message for your audience.
Okay. It's a perfect way to end it. I want to thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed the show. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge with everyone. Most
So
appreciate.
if you can
Yes, sir.
put a link for
I
our,
will do.
JFK chokeholds.com, again, you'll be able to know more about the book, the authors, and you'll be able to follow us on X. I'm expecting, Brent, some breaking news on something pretty big that
Okay.
we will send you. Okay, because I told you we went to the archives.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
dug out some interesting things that Andrew Eiler might talk to you about, also a fellow Canadian and fellow
Yeah.
poet. So thanks a lot, Brent. And
He's at the Santa Claus parade tonight. I had invited him to come on afterwards, but he said he's busy with the Santa Claus. But maybe he's playing Santa. Who knows? I did it before. I didn't even have to put makeup or a fat thing on. So
oh, I've done Santa Claus myself, believe me.
I'm Brent Holland from the Brent Holland Show. Look after each other out there. Everybody is hurting. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.